great way to figure out what buildings are beautiful is where people take their wedding photos. People get married at old factories. That tells us that we're not doing very well now at the buildings we build that are contemporary, because we so cherish our ancestors' stinky old warehouses. They're not stinky anymore, but our great-grandfathers would be really surprised. They would be saying, really? You're getting married there? Can't you do any better?
If you're one of those many Australians building or renovating a house, or perhaps you have a new development rising in your neighbourhood, then you may want to consider the ideals of street level, a new grassroots movement encouraging BIMBY, Beauty in My Backyard. Millie Main is our guest today. She is Street Level's determined founder and Perth chapter lead. She admits there's an ambitious road ahead for her to change our city's thinking and encourage more classical architecture, the use of sustainable building materials, and to empower local families and neighbourhoods in creating more connected and livable communities. I'm Sonia Nolan, and you're listening to My Warm Table.
Millie, welcome to, well, it's actually your warm table that we're sitting at today. Thank you for having me at your warm table and for sharing with me and the My Warm Table community everything that you are so passionate about now, which is street level. You're the founder and the Perth chapter lead of this very new, very grassroots movement that's going to revolutionise the way that we look at our streets and our communities. Tell me what Street Level is, Millie.
Well, thank you for having me, Sonia. Street Level is an advocacy organisation focused on the built environment. So that means buildings and architecture and planning, so the way that those buildings sit together and fit together. But our purpose is to restore beauty back into the built environment. So if you're from Perth or another regional or large town around Australia, you're probably familiar with some of the beautiful heritage buildings that we have. In Perth, for example, we have the state buildings.
Yes.
Which we cherish. And luckily for us, they've been carefully restored and they're being stewarded so the next generation can enjoy them.
And they've been repurposed, haven't they? So going from what they were as state administrative buildings, they are now areas for hospitality and fun and connection.
Yeah, which is what we call adaptive reuse. So one of the ways you can tell something's beautiful is because people find it worth reusing for another purpose outside of its original purpose. And one of the things we really want to see happen is not just heritage restoration and revival, but the building of new things that are beautiful in the classical tradition. So traditional architecture as opposed to contemporary architecture, which happens not at all in Australia, so we don't have any of that happening right now.
I was going to say, why is that? Why are we not seeing those traditional classical buildings being built in Australia anymore?
I'll go through a couple of the reasons. The first is that design schools don't spend much time on it anymore. So they do learn some of the fundamentals sometimes, but a lot of them don't instruct new architects in the basics of how you design a traditional building. And that's because a movement emerged in the middle of the last century in resistance to classical and traditional architecture that's been really powerful and persuasive. And anyone who's intending to study architecture or thinking about it often expects to design beautiful buildings because that's part of the reason they go into it. And
Absolutely.
then I've heard from people who've graduated or who are studying that they're sometimes just surprised or disappointed they're not learning that. So that's one reason. And another reason is we live in a culture that emphasizes the disposable and the planned obsolescence of a washing machine. You'll now see in construction where we're used to the idea that a building might be built and 30 years later torn down again. The environmental impacts of it are really vast. So 38% of global carbon emissions is generated by the construction industry.
38%, wow.
5% by concrete alone. And when you compare that to some of the buildings, for example, built by the Romans and the Egyptians, not the pyramids, but the temples, those are lasting 1,500 years. Roman concrete was amazing. We've got a lot to learn from the Romans.
Well, we have consistently, don't we?
And so look, when people say something's cheaper, it's not actually true. It's just cheaper in the short term. It's short-term thinking. If for every building we were to invest marginally more, because building something like the state building does not cost twice or three times as much Perhaps now, because we have degraded the skills base so much, it would cost a bit more. But once a building gets over a certain size, you reach efficiencies of scale that mean that those costs aren't as much as you would think, and glass is actually the most expensive building material. So if a building is going to be torn down in 20 or 30 years, you have to factor in what that building costs to replace, and also the maintenance and depreciation. And so we find that it's actually cheaper to build high quality, enduring buildings that people love. It's not necessarily a problem of architects or architecture, it's the culture, the economy, policy making.
There's so much to the thinking and the foundations, pardon the pun, of what Street Level is doing. But tell me about Street Level as an organisation that you're leading and that you founded.
We are in Perth, but we're also in the other states of Australia. Not every state yet, but we're trying to get there. So we have chapter leads in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide, and the far north coast of New South Wales. And we're a group of people who are not necessarily urban design or architecture professionals, but we range from people who are in the industry to just concerned citizens. And we all believe in beauty. We all believe that beauty can be defined and that we should seek it out, and that beauty is what makes us feel at home in the world, in the words of Roger Scruton. And we're all doing different things in our local areas to realise Street Level's vision and objectives.
Millie, what inspired you to actually do this?
Becoming more aware of my own senses and experience as I returned from Perth after living in Melbourne for a couple of years. And I'd always felt deeply uncomfortable about the built environment in Perth, but I started reading more about what people were doing in an emerging global movement, because we are part of a global movement. So there are organisations in other countries doing similar things to what we're doing, and so we take kind of inspiration from them. It was a rational response to seeing the volume. So there is development happening everywhere, and there's new buildings coming up every day that I don't like. And I would see people getting into fights that would take 5 years out of your life, because if there's going to be a building coming into your local area, you don't like it, starting to fight it is a huge psychic drain. It takes a lot of time and energy, and it is David and Goliath, because most people don't have the resources. I wouldn't want to do it. And so I thought, well, we can't just keep being reactionary. Somebody needs to have an alternative vision and approach. And so I sat down and I wrote a strategy. And so what we've been talking about now is a little bit of the bits and pieces of that, but I'm certainly willing for anyone who's interested to sit down and talk to them through the detail of it, because we are trying to be quite strategic about it and quite pragmatic, because we are aware of the realities of, the political realities and the economic realities. But if you walk down the street in Perth and you just look at the better buildings, the beautiful buildings, the traditional buildings, and you look at the stuff that's coming up now to outnumber them, anyone can see that in 50 years, the beauty factor of our cities will be vastly diminished unless we change course.
So we were talking earlier, Millie, about laneways in streets, and we were talking about the idea of loneliness and connection in communities. There are all sorts of things that sit at the heart of why you're wanting to create Street Level as a grassroots movement.
So it's definitely not driven by aesthetics or design or wanting something that looks good. It's about the encouraging stronger human relationships. So stronger communities, better relationships between friends, families, people, neighbours, which is the essence of life. The way that our cities are designed now is typically to enhance mobility or transport links or the efficient movement of goods from A to B, which is an organising philosophy that has negative consequences, we believe, on relationships, because when decisions are made, they're usually made on the basis of productivity or efficiency, which is all important, but probably not as important as human relationships.
Well, that's interesting what you were just saying there. So our modern cities are designed for transport, the transportation of goods from A to B, like you've just said. They're very much designed around car parks, the car being key stakeholder of a city, right? Look back to what you were saying earlier about the Romans and the ancient or traditional cultures, and even in Europe where we're all wanting to go and visit and to take in the aesthetics and the beauty and the surrounds of Europe and those cobblestone laneways and the piazzas. And, you know, again, coming back to my Italian heritage, and my father would always talk about la piazza. That's where everybody would connect. That's where everyone would come together in the middle of the town.
Yes.
And that's where you'd meet someone, and that's where you would form those relationships and catch up with what was going on. And the idea of la passeggiata, in the evening, people would have somewhere to promenade and talk and connect and exercise. And, you know, that's what communities were built on. And the structure of those towns supported that.
I love that.
You know, you're sort of making me really think about this, Millie. You know, our cities are not designed with la piazza. Our cities are not designed to go and just have a stroll around and meet someone along the way. That would be a happy coincidence rather than a deliberate intention.
That's right. There's lots to say. The car was probably a huge mistake in many ways because we're in a catch-22 with it. We all have cars. It's really hard to take it away because it's how we get around. So pragmatically, you need to build roads and you need to design the cities that we have because this is what we've set up for ourselves. So to backtrack from that takes an ambitious and bold, holistic strategy. So we have ideas for that. What I will say about La Piazza and La Passeggiata, I hope I got those right.
You did beautifully.
Is that as Australians, and we talk about this at street level a lot, we spend thousands of dollars traveling to Europe, Asia, the cities of the old world, but also the new world, America, to bask in their beauty, and yet there's something in us telling ourselves that we can't have that or that it's not possible. We don't think that's true. We think we should aim higher. We're up against pretty strong vested and systemic issues preventing it, but there are small places you can start, and we're also calling for other more radical changes to planning.
What sort of radical changes to planning are you calling on?
So we advocate for a different approach to planning that most governments use now. So we are trying to educate planners who join our ranks or to encourage them to study classic planning. So that is an approach to planning oriented around truth, beauty and goodness. Another way of talking about truth, beauty and goodness in the built environment is firmitas, utilitas and venutas.
Venutus. So what's venutus mean? Is that?
That would be beauty.
That's beauty. Yeah.
Firmitas basically means firmness. So it's the opposite to infirmness. Infirmness means sick.
Right.
So it means a healthy building.
Yes.
Like the state buildings, you can tell it's robust and healthy and it's strong and it's going to last. And so utilitas is useful.
Of course.
It means it should have utility. That's the thing we're best at. But in a way, it should have true usefulness. So, for example, the flour factory is in Queen Street in the city, but I think it is a former flour factory. Just around the corner from that are some apartments that have been redeveloped and used to be humble warehouses, or a barn that people get married in. A great way to figure out what buildings are beautiful is where people take their wedding photos.
Ah, of course.
People get married at old factories. That tells us that we're not doing very well now at the buildings we build that are contemporary because we so cherish our ancestors' stinky old warehouses. They're not stinky anymore, but our great-grandfathers would be really surprised. They would be saying, really? You're getting married there? Can't you do any better?
So beauty we've covered and longevity is that other side of, what you've just said as well, is that, and that's a premise of street level, is that understanding of longevity and making sure that, that they will last and they can be repurposed. You're advocating for gentle density and human-centred places. What do you mean by gentle density?
Gentle density would be familiar to anyone who has ever visited the best cities of the world. So Paris is a great example of gentle density. It tends to go up to 6 stories, 7 stories, 8 stories. It doesn't have many skyscrapers. It has a couple now. But Paris is more dense than New York. Barcelona's more dense than New York. Paris is more dense than Hong Kong.
Is that so?
We tend to assume you need skyscrapers to address housing availability and affordability, but it's not necessarily true. if you can get that gentle density right, then you can make density more attractive to people who live in existing areas where density is being proposed and cut through some of the political impasse that exists in neighbourhoods where there's tension between existing residents and future residents. And our hypothesis is that if some of this gentle density that's being built in Perth's middle and inner ring can be more beautiful, then we will have a more palatable political solution to urban sprawl.
And so how do we make it more beautiful? Is it by using better materials? Is it by thinking about sustainability principles? Is it about landscaping? How do we define beauty for the urban landscape in a gentle density type of environment where you've got houses, families who've lived there for a long time and neighbours, and then all of a sudden, and I've got this example with a very good friend of mine in Como, that their area is being very quickly superseded by these gentle density 6-7 story high rises coming through.
So there will be different answers from different people when you ask what's beautiful. And when I say from different people, if you were to ask design professionals, they would say, it's design excellence. I think that answer is a little bit ambiguous and doesn't quite hit the mark. I would say that if you want beautiful, go for tradition. And I'm a big believer in the phrase, it's not good because it's old because it's good.
Yes.
Heritage architecture is beloved. There's a reason for that. There may actually be a scientific justification for it, the emerging field in neuroaesthetics that researches why people respond to architecture the way they do. But to me, the best example is where people get married. I just don't think let's not overcomplicate it.
Yeah.
And it's natural materials. People can tell when something's flimsily built. And I'll give the example of, we're in North Perth, so I'll talk about the North Perth Fire Station or Town Hall. If you look at that and compare it to some of the buildings that were built in East Perth at the time of its redevelopment, you'll notice that the buildings in East Perth look a little bit traditional, but they lack something. What they lack is, for one, enduring materials, so high quality materials, but they also lack an authenticity. And so that's why it's really important to have a approach to designing traditional architecture that's really oriented in a strong understanding of the foundations of it, because if you attempt it without that, you get kind of kitschy looking, pastiche looking stuff that gives it a bad name.
For many people, budget is a reason why we've got something that looks quite beautiful but is not quite there. So how do we manage that?
This is one of the trickiest problems that we have to solve, actually. So I can't say that I've figured it out, but one thing that people can do is think about what options exist for them. So if it's practical, for example, if you're building your own house, to think about what materials are more sustainable and to try to use them if possible, because they're not always more expensive. I think sometimes you might just go for the prefab thing because somebody suggested it to you and hey, why not? But we know from experiences like the flammable cladding crisis in Melbourne that these things can have inbuilt consequences. So it's almost like buying cheap home insurance or something. You might pay for it later on. At a more system level, I suppose, what we would really love to see is some recognition by government that it may be essential to either incentivize or subsidize longevity if we're going to solve some of the root causes of the climate crisis and not merely just try to offset, but to actually invest in addressing root causes.
And that brings us to sustainability, and that's another key area of street level. And we had a chat yesterday, Millie, and I was fascinated by the wisdom you were bringing to the conversation about the traditional approaches to sustainability. And in fact, if we just turned our gaze back to the classics again, we can actually see that there were so many sustainable solutions already built into the way that they constructed their homes or their places of worship. It's all there. The sustainable design principles are often in our rear vision mirror and not necessarily through the windscreen. So tell us about some of the clever principles we can learn from the past?
Well, of course, when people used to build buildings and they didn't have electricity, they had to do something to make those places comfortable and livable. And so depending on the climate, I mean, there's hundreds of different ways that you can make a house actually almost completely energy passive, which they had to do because they had no energy. And so an example of that would be if you look at some of the buildings of the subcontinent or Asia and India where it's really tropical and hot, they'll design a window in a certain way to capture the wind so as to sustain the coolness and keep away the heat. Or you can look at our example of Queenslanders. So that's an example of designing for a climate. And if you go to Queensland, such as a town like Charters Towers or Townsville, and look at the heritage architecture there, you'll notice it tends to have arcades and verandas.
Oh, yes.
It's painted white.
Yes.
Whereas if you compare that to some contemporary architecture, glassy, with prefab materials, and you look at what's being built in Melbourne, it's really similar to what's being built in Vancouver and Hong Kong. So we're building the same stuff everywhere, and it's actually really bad for the environment to build something that needs energy-hungry HVAC system. And even if you try to say, well, we're going to offset it, buying carbon credits or having solar panels, it's still not as good as just designing something that's climate passive anyway.
Tell me about the wisdom from some of these traditional countries. They all solved the problems in similar ways, but in very different, separate places, in separate times, not knowing that the other was working on the same sort of problem.
That's right. A good example to look at as well as Japan. So traditional Japanese joinery is designed to withstand earthquakes. It's obviously an earthquake-prone country. And so they would build buildings with embedded resilience and a little bit of flexibility in the joinery so that that building could shake a little bit without falling down. And those techniques were sophisticated, developed over millennia, and they're still practiced.
The cities that we're building now, I've heard you speak about this, Millie. You're saying that the cities we're building now are actually quite fragile cities.
An example would be floodplains. We tend to build a lot on floodplains, but historically, in different places, you'll find different approaches to planning that will, for example, put a large public garden where there may be sea level rise or floodplains, say. But now, if we're looking at sea level rise, we may not build in certain places because we expect that. And that doesn't mean that that land is forgone, but it just means that you might have, for example, a beautiful botanic garden. And if that were to become flooded, it wouldn't be a catastrophe. There'd be less loss of human life.
So it's really thinking ahead to climate change and what's going to happen to us in the future and planning accordingly.
If you think that at some point we may be in a different set of circumstances, the most resilient city to build is one that's more like Paris or Kyoto or Lisbon, that has stood the test of time and it's still around after millennia. And that's the classic planning approach and the approach that we think we can draw on now to make our cities more beautiful and more resilient. And the best selling point is not actually, I believe, sustainability. Even though it's really important, I don't think it's enough to move people. I think the best selling point is beauty.
And those classic cities that you've just referred to, Lisbon, Kyoto, and to Paris, what is it that makes them so livable and so beautiful? I know the architecture is beautiful and I know that the buildings have stood the test of time. And is it the walkability? Is it the zoning or the lack of zoning? Is it, what are the key ingredients? If you had to, sort of make a recipe out of them, what would you do? What would you say needed to be in that?
Well, actually, somebody has tried to make a bit of a recipe out of it. And yeah, he is an architect and planner, and he wrote a book called The Art of Classic Planning, which we use and talk about a lot. And he visited 100 cities around the world and tried to understand what it was that made them so good. And a couple of the things that does contribute to it are an understanding of genius loci, which means the magic of a place, which may get you laughed out of an executive room or a boardroom if you start talking about it here. But the Romans used it. They would try to figure out what the magic of any place was before they built there. I guess to a modern, it means working with the natural environment and not against it. So where are the mountains? What direction is the wind blowing in? Where are the rivers? And how do we situate a city based on that knowledge? Luckily, unlike some other countries, we have a group of people that understands genius loci very well, and that's the local Indigenous people of an area.
Yes.
And so I think that when Indigenous people are involved and consulted in modernist planning, it's often tokenistic. Classic planning is probably the best solution for an authentic integration of the Indigenous viewpoint into how to build a good city. If we could integrate some of that understanding into the way we build cities now, we could acknowledge things that would allow us to build more beautifully. And I know that sounds a little bit vague, but I'll just explain some of the elements of a beautiful classic city. So they tend to have, as you mentioned, promenades. They make really good use of the riverfront. They actually build right up to the riverfront so that there's human enjoyment and connection happening in the most beautiful places. There are people who want this now, and Perth has had a movement, for example, to bring something like streetcars in or trams in for a long time. It's just that because of the way our government works, those interests usually lose out to people who are advocating for transit or infrastructure-oriented approaches to planning that ask questions such as, what use should this land be, and how could we, get people faster from the south of the north to the river, instead of how do we build things that let us create a city that fosters human pleasure, enjoyment, and relationships, which in my view should be the number one thing, and everything else should be subservient to that, which is not to say that you forget about really important things like transport and sewerage and utilities. Those are all things that are in the methodology. It's just that they are in their appropriate place. They're not leading what we do.
Describe for me how sprawled Perth is in comparison to other cities in the world.
Well, Perth is the longest city in the world because of how sprawling it is, which can't go on forever. It's got to stop somewhere. Government knows that. And Perth is up there with the most sprawling and unsustainable cities in the world, like Houston.
It is, you're right. It does sprawl out, up and down and across. It is a very sprawly city. And I guess we're just used to that, as a person from Perth who's lived in Perth pretty much all my life. This is what you're just used to it, aren't you? But that is not what other cities are like.
No, it's possible to do so much better. And it's actually a real equity issue. So I talk to people sometimes from who live in Claremont and Cottesloe, and they say, well, Australians need their space and we just need our 2x4 or whatever it is now. It's like 4x6. And it's not true, actually. There are people who are choosing to live in apartments and choosing to live in low-rise, medium-density buildings, and I think we can do much better by them, but we can also do much better by the people who live in suburbs that are just not as enjoyable as it is to live near the coast. Beauty is so important for the soul and so important for people's well-being, and we overlook that. I'd hate to think of what it's doing to our poor, fried synapses and psyches. It's probably much worse for our health than we realise or recognise.
How can people get involved?
If you go to our website, there's links to our events, and you can also join a chapter. So you can become a member of Street Level and align yourself with a local chapter. And we have chapter leads in the major cities, but we're also looking for more. So if it's something that interests you and you're a person who thrives on community organising and making things happen, then we invite you to consider it, because it's a really cool and fun group of people that are all really good friends and all really have a shared passion. And of course there's all the usual stuff, like you can follow us on social media, and we're also publishing different tools There's a gallery on our website of inspiration. So if you're interested in what I'm talking about, you can go and see how around the world people are building new traditional architecture and see what that looks like.
And we'll put all of those links on the show notes so everyone can easily access them, Millie. So that's great. But how does it work, Millie?
So when you join Street Level, you join a community of people who have spent some time developing some of these ideas and tools. And so when you find yourself in a conversation about this, you won't feel overwhelmed or like you don't know what to say to people. So we want to equip people with persuasive pictures and arguments and tools. So we have stuff like letter templates you can send to councils, kits that you can work on with your community so you can go and show people what you want and talk to your neighbours and talk to local councillors and give them a presentation and identify your local priorities. So figure out what the biggest pain points are in your area, working with like-minded people. And that might be that you want to prevent inappropriate development in the future and that you want to set a vision for what we call BIMBY. So this is something that was coined by the Prince's Foundation in the UK, but they call it BIMBY, which is beauty in my backyard. So instead of being a NIMBY or a YIMBY, you could be a BIMBY.
So a NIMBY is not in my backyard. What's a YIMBY?
Yes, in my backyard.
Oh, yes, in my. So this is a BIMBY, beauty in my backyard. Oh, okay, I like that.
If you feel comfortable, you can perform advocacy at the local level, so you can meet with councillors and developers and other people with a stake and drum up other people to be part of the movement and to do some awareness raising. There's the opportunity to help shape the central organisation and the policy goals that we're working on as well. So to work with the national group of Street Level and help us to develop some of these ambitious metropolitan level planning policy ideas that we work on.
So you're really looking at this long-term plan and this is not a movement that's going to be done in 5 minutes. This is something that you're committed to for the long term, because it is changing mindset, it's changing behaviour, it's changing policy, it's allowing people to reflect and think about how we can do this better.
When it comes to the building of the buildings, you have to think, I'm building this for future generations, but this is going to take ages. We need people to get on board with this. We really do, because it's normal people who will have a conversation about this over the dinner table with their friends. They're going to help us change the national dialogue. Just like climate change didn't used to be part of the conversation or recycling didn't used to be a thing, we need beauty in the built environment and longevity in the built environment to be a thing that people talk about.
Thank you so much, Millie. It's been fascinating and wonderful to reconnect with you.
Yes.
And I'm so excited about this new venture that you've got. I really wish you well, and I hope that the My Warm Table community can start talking about this around their warm tables.
I hope so. Thank you for the opportunity.
You've been listening to My Warm Table with Sonia Nolan. In Italian, a tavola calda is a warm and welcoming table where you can share big ideas, friendship, laughter and life. So much happens around the kitchen table, and I wanted to amplify it here in this podcast. My aim is to feed your mind and soul through smart conversations with heart. No topic is off limits, but good table manners rule. I hope you'll join us each week as we set the table for my extraordinary guests who will let you feast on their deep knowledge, life experiences, and wise insights. Let's keep the conversation flowing. Please subscribe to the My Warm Table podcast and share it with your friends and networks. Perhaps if they're new to podcasting, take a moment to show them how to download and subscribe so they don't miss an episode either. I'd also love you to join our community on Facebook. You'll find the group at My Warm Table Podcast. Your support is very much appreciated so that together we can eat, think, and be merry.